let's talk about deriving some of our basic trig functions. We're going to look at the 30 and the 60 first. So let's take a look at a triangle. And let's suppose that triangle has all the same size angles in it. If a triangle has 180 degrees and it has 3 angles, that would mean all the angles would be 60 degrees. So this is perfect for what we need to do. So let's suppose that in that triangle that has all 3 angles that are the same, if I were to divide this angle in half, that would make that angle 30 degrees. That would make that angle 90 degrees. Especially, if I've divided it in half and it were an altitude, that would divide these sides in half. And if all the angles are the same, that means all the sides are the same. Now, if you open an angle, you could have an opening of an angle, and the lengths could all be different. I could have a 30-degree angle with an opening that had 1 unit, or I could double it, and it could be 2 units, but the angle could stay the same. So let's just say that this triangle all the way around is 2 units. We're just arbitrarily picking that. We're just saying we know they're the same, let's just pick a number. So if I were to do that, if I had divided this one in half like I just did, that would make each of these pieces 1. So if I were to do, let's say, the sine of 30 degrees, side opposite over hypotenuse would be 1 over 2. And so that's how we get the sine of 30 degrees. If I wanted to do the cosine of 30 degrees, that would be adjacent over hypotenuse, and I don't have the adjacent side, so I would need to use my Pythagorean theorem to actually find it. So c squared would be 4. We know one of the legs, we don't know the other one. So b squared would be 3, which means that b would be the square root of 3. So this is the square root of 3. So now we have everything we need. Let's go to another page so we can pull it out and look at it. We have this triangle, 30 degrees here, 2 here, 1 here, square root of 3 here. So sine of 30 is 1 over 2, side opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine of 30 is side adjacent over hypotenuse. And tangent of 30 is opposite over adjacent. And if I were to rationalize, I get square root of 3 over 3. So that's where your 3 basic trig functions come. And remember, to get the other 3, you would take the reciprocals of those. So let's look at the 60 degree now. Back at our triangle that we had, and we had 60, 60, 60. We divided that in half, which made this 30. So we have the triangle that looks like this. This is 30, this is 60. We know this side, we know this side, we know this side. So sine of 60, opposite over hypotenuse, is square root of 3 over 2. And notice that they're opposites. 60 and 30 are opposites. Cosine of 60 degrees is side adjacent over hypotenuse. So adjacent of 30 is square root of 3, but adjacent of 60 is 1. Notice they're opposites. Tangent of 60 degrees, side opposite over adjacent, square root of 3 over 1, so it's square root of 3. So now we have the 3 basic trig functions of 60 degrees. So that's how we get those. Let's take a So you can see what we did. We found, this is the one where we did the 45. And before we did the rationalization, we found the opposite side, using our Pythagorean theorem. And we came up with that one. We came up with the square root of 2. So originally when we did this one, sides, I can do sine of 45, opposite over hypotenuse would be 1 over the square root of 2. And if I were to rationalize that, I would get square root of 2 over 2. So that's sine of 45. If I do cosine of 45, side adjacent of this 45-degree angle would be 1. Hypotenuse would be square root of 2. So it's going to come out the same. If I were to rationalize, I'm going to get square root of 2 over 2. So the sine and the cosine of 45 degrees are the same. Now, if I wanted to do tangent of 45, I would get side opposite over adjacent. So the tangent of 45 degrees is 1. So we do have some basic ones now. We had 1 square root of 2, and we had side opposite over hypotenuse, and then we rationalized it. So that was the sign before we rationalized it, and if I flip from this point, I get square root of 2 for cosecant. So if I do the same in the 60, so remember we had that this side was 1 because we took half of it and it made that the half of 2 was 1. This side was still a 2. And when I did that, this side was a square root of 3. And so if I did the sine of 30, when I did that, we got the 1/2, which that one was the easy one. And we could flip that. That was no problem. When we did the cosine, though, we get side adjacent over hypotenuse. And if I flip that one, I get 2 over the square root of 3. And so when I flip that one, I'm going to have to rationalize. Unless you remember that sine and cosine are opposites of each other. So if I do the 60, so if I do the cosine of 60 degrees, the cosine of 60 degrees would be side adjacent over hypotenuse, and the sine of 60 degrees would be side opposite over hypotenuse. So once I figure out what these things are, I can go with the theory that the sine and cosine are opposite for 30 and 60, which means that cosecant and secant are opposite for the 360. So if I go and I try to find the reciprocal of sine for 60, and I rationalize, I get 2 square root of 3 over 3. And that's going to be the reciprocal of sine of 60, and the reciprocal of sine is cosecant. So when I do the cosecant of 60, I get 2 square root of 3 over 3, which means, too, that the secant of 30 is 2 square root of 3 over 3. So they're the opposites of each other. So let me see if I can narrow this to a whole chart. So if I do 30, 60, 45, and I do sine, cosine, tangent, reciprocal of sine is cosecant, and secant, and then we'll do cotangent in just a minute. Running out of room here. So sine of 30 is 1/2, which means that cosecant is 2. No big deal. Sine of 60 is square root of 3 over 2, which means we just did the reciprocal of sine and got the cosecant, which was 2 square root of 3 over 3. If sine and cosine are opposites of each other for the 30 and the 60, that means that for cosine of 60, we have square root of 3 over 2, and 1/2 for this one. See, they're opposites. That also means that cosecant of 60 is the same thing as the secant of 30. So that helps me build that chart there. So that also means that the opposites apply, so that the secant and the cosecant are opposites for 60. So that would mean that 2 would go there. So we're well on our way to building that chart. The sine of 45 is square root of 2 over 2. And the cosine is square root of 2 over 2. And we said that the tangent was 1. And we said that the tangent of 30 degrees was square root of 3 over 3. And the tangent of 60 degrees was square root of 3. So if I'm going to do cotangent of each one of those, let's think about this a little bit. If I do the cotangent of 30 degrees, that means that I am flipping tangent. Now, if I flip tangent, I get this, and I would have to rationalize, and I would get 3 square root of 3 over 3. So that would be the cotangent of 30 degrees, if I were to do it that way. Now, if I cancel, though, I get square root of 3. And if I take a look at some of the things that I have up here, notice that square root of 3 already appears on my chart as the tangent of 60 degrees. So the cotangent and the tangent of 30 and 60 are also opposite. So if the cotangent of 30 is the square root of 3, the tangent of 60 is the square root of 3, which means that whatever the tangent of 30 is going to be the cotangent of 60. So that's where that comes from. Now the cotangent of 45 is easy because the reciprocal of 1 is just 1. So there's my chart, and those are the basic trig functions that you can come up with. Now for 0 and 90, use some basic definitions that we have here. And you just need to remember that sine is going to be, in our quadrant, is going to be the y value for now. We'll talk about y later. Cosine is going to be the x value. And tangent is going to be sine divided by cosine. So if I look at my basic quadrant and I go out, any number of things if I'm looking at this. But most of the time we go out units. And so in those same triangles that we were talking about, we had the 1 as our leg. So if I go out 1 on this, this is the 0.10. So this would be the 0.01. So for my basic trig functions, if I'm looking at this, the sine of 0 degrees, if that's the y value, is going to be 0. So the sine of 0 is going to be 0. The cosine of 0 is going to be 1. If I'm dividing and I put, y over x, let's think about that one for just a minute. Y is 0, x is 1, so 0 divided by 1 is 0, so tangent of 0 is 0. If I go over here to 90, and I do sine, so sine of 90, which is the y value, would be 1. Cosine would be 0. And if I divide that one, 1 divided by 0 cannot be done, so we say that the tangent of 90 is undefined. And you will see that your basic trig chart, you're going to see all of those basic things in your basic trig chart that you're going to see. So you will see in your online, you will see a chart that looks like this. It'll have degrees and it'll have radians. And so it'll have 0, it'll have 30, it'll have 45, 60, and it'll have 90. And so it'll have the degrees, it'll have the radians where we've changed it, and you have a lesson on how to do that. So pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2. It'll have the sign of each of those. It'll have the cosine of each of those. It will have sine, cosine. It will have the tangent of each one of those. It'll have a dash here for the 90 because it's telling you that it's undefined. Then it'll have sine, cosine, tangent. It'll have the cosecant. This one will be undefined. It'll have the, make sure I wrote them down right. It'll have the secant. Dash for that one because it's undefined. And then it'll have the cotangent. Dash for that one because it's undefined. So this is your chart that's in your online class. You're going to need to memorize those. So you're going to want to make sure that you have those memorized. But that's where they come from. With, we have 30 degrees, we have 60 degrees, and we have 45 degrees. And if we look at sine, cosine, and tangent, if we were to build a chart, we now know that the sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. We know the cosine of 30 degrees is square root of 3 over 2. And we know that the tangent of 30 degrees is square root of 3 over 3. It's the opposite for 60 degrees. So you can just reverse these and know that the sine of 60 degrees is square root of 3 over 2. The cosine is 1/2. And the tangent of 60 degrees is square root of 3. For 45 degrees, the sine and the cosine are both the same. And the tangent is 1. Now, if we wanted to try to get the other trig functions of that, we would have cosecant, we would have secant, and we would have cotangent. So if you do the reciprocal of, what you started with, some of these are a little easier than others. The cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So let's do 30, 60, and 45. If I go back to 30 degrees and I do the reciprocal of sine, if I flip 1/2, I get 2. So that one's easy. If I go back to cosine of 60 degrees, the reciprocal of cosine is secant, and so if I flip 1/2, I get 2. If I go back and I flip the cotangent of 45 degrees, if I flip 1 over 1, that's going to be a 1. So if I'm looking at some of these are a little easier to see than others. Now, if I flip the sine of 60 degrees, I'm going to get a radical in the denominator. So if I flip it, it's probably best to go back and flip from where we were doing the rationalization.